Hello, and welcome to what will hopefully be our final online lecture for this class. This lecture is going to complete the job that was started in the last lecture, which is going a little bit deeper with the so-called self-refutation argument that is found in Plato's Theaetetus. Remember, last time we went into a fair bit of detail about what the Protagonistic relativist thesis actually says, right? We talked about what it means to believe this thesis, what this thesis claims, and so what we believe if we believe it, okay? And I did that so that we would be sure to have a proper understanding of the self-refutation claims that are made. Because this is actually, if you think about it, a fairly significant issue. Whether or not all truths or some subset of truths is relative to what individuals believe in the way that's claimed is something that I think a lot of people at least entertain when it comes to some subject matters. They might not be fully committed to relativism, but they think it's a plausible candidate. And so this idea that at least when applied universally, Protagorean relativism has a significant issue and is self-refuting, that would be an important result, right? If we could show this. Now, I say in terms of a particular subset of subject matter when I describe ordinary sympathies towards relativism, because for many of us, there are lots of directly observable truths that we would never endorse relativism with respect to. So most of us aren't going to actually disagree or claim that relativism is true with respect to claims like it is raining today, right? No one's going to say, well, for you it's raining, for me it's not, right? We're not inclined to hold relativism in those cases. We can go a little bit more abstract, and as we introduce more abstraction and make it more difficult to confirm what is being claimed with direct sensory observation, we also introduce some doubt. When we start going more abstract and we are less able to appeal to observations that another person can directly make to resolve disputes, the possibility of relativism seems to creep in. So, just to be clear about what relativism actually claims, let's take an example, okay? Let's imagine that you are a relativist about the methods that are available to get at truth of a certain kind, okay? So in particular, let's imagine that you're a relativist about science, about scientific truth. So what does that mean? Okay? And it's important to be clear about what relativism actually is, because I think in many cases, individuals are attracted to relativism when in fact, what it seems that they want to express is some real criticism about the position that either they have or the position that someone else has. Okay, and I think often both of these things, like an anxiety about your own position and also a belief that someone else has something wrong, I think both of these things can sometimes be expressed by a commitment to relativism that I don't actually think is real. So let's just hold everything apart and see what relativism looks like. So when I say that you are a relativist about science as a method, I'm saying something quite particular. Okay, so I think that the best way to understand what science is and what it means to believe in science is to understand that there's something called the scientific method, which has some steps that we need to follow. And this is a method. And that this method is something that was devised as a way to counteract biases that humans have, right? So, for example, we're all susceptible to confirmation biases, meaning that if we have a particular idea and then we look at evidence, we are strongly inclined to pay more attention to the idea's evidence that confirms what it is that we already believed than we are to pay attention to the evidence that disconfirms it. Now, this is not true in all cases. There are cases where you can imagine a person not having a lot of self-confidence in a particular context. And so in that context, let's say they're in a university classroom and it's a topic they don't know much about. Even if they have the correct idea, they might look for evidence that shows that other people think it's wrong, or they might think of reasons why it might be wrong, right? So this isn't always true, but in lots of cases, we tend to engage in this bias. And so the scientific method is a attempt to get around some of these biases by producing a list of rules, by operationalizing the activity so that we don't make these mistakes. So faith in belief in science, I think, is best understood in terms of faith in that method. This is importantly different than believing any totality of truths that the scientific community believes at any given time, right? Because part of the scientific method is a humility, a recognition that we can be completely wrong, and we need to have ways of making it easier to detect when we're wrong, because we can go very wrong, right? So this faith in science is going to be a faith in the method. Now, what would it be to be a relativist about that? To not think that the scientific method was any better or worse than other methods of collecting truth? Well, importantly, relativism is more than just the recognition that the way that this method is applied is often really, really flawed, right? So it's possible for you to not be a relativist at all about the scientific method as a means of gathering truth vis-a-vis the others, but you are still deeply critical of the actual real-world applications of this method, or perhaps even of our ability to apply it in any way that is better than, chance. We have no real skill for doing this. It's beyond us. Those things are not relativism about the scientific method as a means of gathering truth. Relativism is more than that, right? So, it's perfectly intelligible and reasonable, and I think warranted, to be very skeptical of research that has funding of a particular sort, right? It's good to know, and this is why research papers need to list who funded the paper, because it's good to know if all of the papers that are pro, some particular herbal supplement come from the country that produces most of that herbal supplement, right? That's just one example. Obviously, if all of the pro-tobacco studies are funded by the tobacco industry, you should worry, right? So what I'm mentioning these things for is because I think oftentimes recognition that such things occur in the actual world can sometimes be expressed as relativism when it's not that. It's something different, okay? So what is it then to be a relativist about this? Well, you would have to think that the scientific method is just one way to look at the world, and it produces truths that are true for it, for that method, but that any other method, or at least some range of methods that it would include some that are incompatible with the scientific method, that there are going to be others that are just as truth securing. Each method produces conclusions that are true for it, but truth is relative to the method. It's almost like if you were doing mathematical calculations in sort of different universes with different rules or different numbering systems or something. I'm not sure how this works, but you could imagine there being two systems. Both of them produce different results. And we just say, well, look, there's no fact of the matter. It's just a question of what was true according to this particular set of mathematical rules. And this method here produces conclusions that are true for it. Right? Like imagine we made two computers that responded differently to the same stimuli. So you put up a red light and one of them, shuts off and the other one shuts off and then turns back on. That's just a response to causes in the universe. And both of those are equally valid. It doesn't make any sense to say that one of them is correct and one of them is incorrect. Right? You have to imagine that that's what we're thinking about when we're thinking about these methods, or even when we're thinking about sense perception. Right? So you have a perception because that's the way you are set up. Just like the computer produces this result when we put the red light up because that's the way it's been programmed. And the other one does this other thing. There's no question of who is right. I mean, first of all, there's no who there, but there's no who for Protagoras either. So if we really want to be a relativist about this one question, about the scientific method when compared to other methods, we have to say that there are multiple methods, at least, that are equally valid. Equally valid. And if we are full-on Protagorean relativists, we have to say that any method is equally valid, and all methods are such that we can say that for them, for that method, certain things are true. So this is what Protagoras would want to say if we were talking about applying the theory to different methods of gathering knowledge. So imagine, for example, that instead of using the scientific method, we rolled dice. Imagine we just rolled dice. And we had a system of rules that said if it's a 3 or below, then the answer to whatever question we ask is yes. And if it's below, then the answer is no. Divination. Okay, it's a fairly common human activity to decide certain kinds of questions. We would have to say that those methods are equally truth-producing. Anything that is produced by those methods is true for the method. And neither method is any better at getting truth. So that's what relativism looks like. And what relativism means, we saw, is best understood as a claim about necessary and sufficient conditions for things being the case in somebody's world. Okay? We could also apply this to the idea of the method that I just gave. So if we're relativists, we would say that if the result is returned that X is F, that the sky is blue, according to the method of gathering truth, then for that method, it is true. Okay? And we said that that needs to mean that there is some world external to the statement itself that is correctly described by that statement, right? That's what it means for something to be true. So part of the Protagorean view is that if a person, because now we're talking about people, I use the example of the method to try to clarify. Sometimes if you think about a new idea in different contexts, it can be helpful for cementing what the idea is, right? So we're talking about individual perceivers. And just like in the case of the methods, we want to say that if something appears to a person, that's the analog of if the method produces it. Right? If something appears to a person, then that thing is true for that person. And last time we talked about a framework where there needs to be some world that makes the truth true, that makes the belief true, some world that the belief needs to correctly describe, because that's what truth is best understood as, correspondence. And so this meant that if someone perceives X, or if X is F seems to be the case for someone, then it is true in their world. Okay? That's what the Protagorean relativist wants to claim about the way things seem to us. Anything that seems to somebody is so for that person. The self-refutation argument, to which we will now turn, is the view that somehow holding that thesis, at least in a particular context where we're having an argument with someone who disagrees with us, that somehow having this as your viewpoint provides conclusive evidence against that viewpoint. So there's something that's supposed to happen, at least in some situations, namely those where people disagree with you, where holding the Protagorean thesis means that you essentially refute yourself. That's what we're dealing with now. Okay? So the Protagorean thesis involves a claim about sufficient conditions, namely that if something seems to you, if X seems F to you, then for you in your world, X is F. It was also, last time, described in terms of a necessary condition. Namely, if it's not the case that something seems to be to you, then it isn't for you. And we can flip that and get a necessary condition where we say, if something is for you, then it appears for you. Right? So we have two statements here, and they're different, and it's important to understand both of them. So one of them is, if something appears for you, then that's the way it is. And the second is, if something is a certain way for you, then it also appears that way for you. Because appearance is a necessary condition for things being a way. Right? So appearance is a sufficient condition. If it appears to you that way, then that's the way it is in the world. It's also a necessary condition. If it doesn't appear to you to be that way, then it's not the case in your world that that is true. Okay? So last time we talked about the difference between having in your head the thought, the wind is not cold, and just not having the thought that the wind is cold. And it was said that it looks like for Protagoras, if you just don't have an opinion, that's probably going to count as it not being the case for you. Right? That's why we say it's both sufficient and necessary. The sufficient part, I think, is easier to grasp, but the necessary part is also important, I think. We have to have a view between the two about it. And I think Bernier, who argues for this position, is right. So let's turn to the self-refutation argument itself. I just sort of gave a bit of a sketch of what we covered when it comes to what does the Protagorean relativist thesis actually claim, right? And that is that appearance is necessary and sufficient for truth, for things being a certain way. Okay. Now we'll turn to the actual self-refutation part. So the context here is important because if we just jump to the part that is best described as the self-refutation argument, and this would be observation 3 below, we're not actually going to get a good argument, because it's important for this argument that there is disagreement. If there isn't a context where people disagree with Protagoras about Protagoras' relativistic doctrine, the self-refutation issues don't emerge. Okay? So last time I talked about this suggestion that there might be certain positions that are dialectically self-refuting. What I meant is in a certain context of disagreement. And this isn't my term. Right? When I say I mean what individuals other than me and also myself who say this believe is that this argument is self-refuting in a particular context only. And we'll see that if other people don't disagree about the truth of Protagorean relativism, it's hard to generate any kind of worry of this sort. You could still have some other things that would worry you, of course. But so anyway, we have here a context. The first observation introduces this idea of disagreement. Socrates observes that if more people fail to perceive the measure doctrine than perceive it, the measure doctrine is more false than true, right? And when I say fail to perceive, that could either be that people don't have an opinion one way or the other, or it could be that they have an opinion to the contrary. Right? So they have an active denial of the measure doctrine. Number 2, if Protagoras and everyone else fail to perceive the measure doctrine, it is true for no one. Right? So if no one has it appear to them that the measure doctrine is true, then it is true for no one. If another person fails to believe that the measure doctrine is true, Protagoras must admit that these persons' beliefs are true. They do not in turn have to do the same. So they don't have to admit that Protagoras' views are true. Thus, Protagoras must admit that the measure doctrine is false. Now, argument 3 here is really what people refer to as the self-refutation argument proper. The other two are certainly related in certain ways, but are, I think, less deserving of the title self-refutation argument. They're related but slightly different. So, first of all, let's look at the first text that kind of introduces this idea. Well, suppose you come to a decision in your mind and then express a judgment about something to me. Let us assume with Protagoras that your judgment is true for you, but isn't it possible that the rest of us may criticize your verdict? Do they always agree that your judgment is true? Or does there rise up against you every time a vast army of persons who think the opposite, who hold that your decisions and your thoughts are false? Okay, so it's being pointed out here that often when we believe something, people often believe the opposite, right? Just an observation. People believe the opposite of what we believe. They also, it says here, hold that your decisions and your thoughts are false. Okay? So it's important here to notice that there is, first of all, disagreements about judgments, right? So people sometimes don't agree that someone's judgment, say Theaetetus' judgment or Protagoras' judgment, sometimes they don't agree that that's true, right? So I judge that Braveheart is a terrible movie and you think it's the greatest movie, okay? So we have, in that case, a disagreement, but that's more, there is more that's going on here, right? It's also that people disagree, they argue against the person who holds the opposite view, they rise up against them, so there's a behavior here, and they hold that your decisions and thoughts are false. Now, this extra bit is an additional belief, right? It's different for me just to believe that Braveheart is bad, and for me to believe also that your opinion is wrong, is false. Right? Those are two different beliefs. One of them is about Braveheart the movie. The other one is about your view. Now, of course, when we standardly commit ourselves to a belief, we also believe that other people who disagree with that are in the wrong. Right? That's part of it. But in this context, it is important to specify that there is this extra commitment. Okay? And that's because if we think about it, there isn't really any self-refutation if we just disagree in beliefs. Okay? And there can be contexts that we treat relativistically, and I think the wind case is really key here. The idea that one of us perceive the wind as cold and the other perceive it as not cold. These contexts are contexts where relativism is plausible or correct. Okay? And it's great that Plato has this be the first taste that we get of this doctrine. Because this is where it makes sense, right? And I think the suggestion is that often when we do make mistakes, it can be because we start with a plausible case and then try to extend it beyond where it is actually plausible. Right? So if Theaetetus believes that the wind is cold and Protagoras doesn't believe that the wind is cold, that type of disagreement doesn't pose obvious issues of self-refutation for Protagorean relativism. Because we just simply end up relativizing truth to the world. And this is what we talked about last time. This is why I stressed that if it's really the case that all appearances are true, and I'll go over this a bit more in this lecture, it has to be that those sentences correctly describe the world of the individual. Okay? That's what we're committing ourselves to if we are Protagorean relativists. If someone holds a belief and we say all beliefs are true, then any belief someone has is going to correctly describe the structure of the world in which they live. Okay? Now, if we believe that, it doesn't follow that the two statements, Theaetetus believes that the wind is cold and Protagoras does not believe that the wind is cold, those don't produce a problem for relativists per se. Because although on the surface it says Theaetetus believes that the wind is cold, and it also says Protagoras does not believe that the wind is cold, on the surface we have the wind in each case. And we're predicating the same predicate, cold, the wind is cold. Remember, a predicate is like the wind is cold. We also describe as predicates Socrates runs. We say that runs is a predicate. That doesn't concern us here, but you'll hear and see the word used in this way too. And it can be confusing at first to get a handle on this is a term that describes both of these cases. But anyway, the wind is cold. So we have Theaetetus believes that the wind is cold. Protagoras does not believe that the wind is cold. If you're a relativist, you can just say, look, each of them has the wind for them. The wind for each person is determined by the way they feel to a certain extent. Maybe not wholly, but at least when it comes to whether the wind is cold or not, that's really, we might think, something that the individual has complete truth of. It's like being in pain, right? If Wittgenstein often, I mentioned earlier that Wittgenstein is very indebted to this dialogue, not necessarily for his views, but in terms of the kinds of questions that this dialogue makes you think about when you engage with it. Wittgenstein says you can't be mistaken about whether you have a headache, whether you're in pain, certain kinds. You can't be mistaken about that. So anyway, we have here these two statements about the wind, and the relativist could say, look, each of them is talking about the wind for them, and so there's no contradiction here. We just relativize truth to a particular world or situation. In the Theaetetus world, the wind is cold. In Protagoras' world, it is not. Now, I say world here, and when I've been talking about this example, I've been kind of stressing that in such cases, we might think that relativism is the thing to say. We might say, look, there's something called the wind, yes, and that's a thing that's out there, but there's also like the wind in terms of the sensible properties it has, and some of those we accept relativism for. Right? We might think, well, if it's cold for the person, then it is cold. So we don't need to say the world. It might be some particular subset of things that are relative. But in the Protagoras case, everybody has their own truth worlds, and this was supposed to hold across the board. By the end, the Protagorean view got to be so large that we really accepted any kind of belief or judgment. Right? And I've focused on this in lectures, the fact that what this view is about and what gets counted as perception seems to grow. Okay? So the point I'm trying to make here is that if we just have disagreeing beliefs, depending on the kind of beliefs, we might not think there's any problem there at all. Okay? And in this case, we might think, even if we're not full-on Protagorean relativists, we might think, well, in some cases, relativism is the best way to go. Now, what about statements 1 and 2 below? Theaetetus believes that a triangle has internal angles equal to 180 degrees. Protagoras believes that the triangle, or a triangle rather, has internal angles equal to 360 degrees. Now, can we relativize this here? It seems like in principle, yes. We can perhaps perform the same trick I say here, but it does sound odd, right? It does sound odd to say that in the Theaetetus world, the triangle has internal angles equal to 180 degrees, and in the Protagoras world, the triangle has internal angles equal to 360 degrees, right? That seems, in a way, it definitely seems more difficult, and it might even be impossible. I mean, so the triangle is also something that we define in a way that means that it has 180 degrees internal angles, I think. And if that's true, then it's not going to be possible for someone to mean that the triangle has internal angles equal to 360 degrees, because that's not what we mean by the triangle. Anyway, it seems strange in this case to say, well, look, for Theaetetus, the triangle does have that, and for Protagoras, it has that. So just to see what that would look like, if we were to try to say, well, this disagreement doesn't also create a problem for us, we could bite the bullet and say, well, no, in the Theaetetus world, the triangle's like that, and in the Protagoras world, the triangle's like that. Now, it's important here, though, in any case, that when we looked at this first bit here, it's not just that there's disagreement, it's also that there's a belief that the others have a false thought, right? That your decisions and your thoughts are false. Okay. So that's there for a reason, okay? And it's there for a reason because if we just think that there's disagreement, there are ways in which we can imagine that the type of disagreement we're acknowledging doesn't lead to self-refutation. So here, we don't just disagree, we also believe that the other person is wrong. We don't know what the issue is quite yet between this double disagreement, this disagreement in terms of one person thinks A and the other person thinks not A, and this other view about the person with whom you disagree having a false belief. We don't yet know what the issue is when that occurs, and we are Protagorean relativists. So we don't yet know what the problem, because this is supposed to be a problem for those views together. Let's move forward and see if we can figure out how this double disagreement might cause an issue. So the next thing that gets said in this stretch of text is the following. Then do you want us to say that you are judging what is true for yourself, but false for the tens of thousands? It looks as if that is what I must say, according to the theory, at any rate. So we have a further concession here that an individual needs to claim that what you are judging is true for yourself, but false for the others. Now, the context here, question, is there also this double disagreement here? Because if there isn't, it's not as clear what the issue might be. So let's just look at it. And first of all, we won't assume that there are two disagreements. There's just one judgment and another judgment that is contrary to that, and no one has a judgment about the other individual's judgments. So if that happens, Theaetetus, it seems, might be able to say that the triangle has 180 degrees for me, but 360 degrees for somebody else. Now, this isn't, I think, a contradiction per se, but we might think it's a contradiction if we think that the word triangle has a fixed meaning for me, the person uttering these two sentences. If that's the case, we might think, if that fixed meaning includes something that has to do with internal angles equal to 180 degrees, that could be a contradiction, okay? But barring that kind of thing, it doesn't seem like it is. You know, if it's not part of the definition of triangle to have a certain number of degrees, then I don't think it's a problem. It's very implausible, right? It's very implausible to say these two things, and it seems to boggle the mind, but it doesn't seem like it's self-contradictory. And if it does, I'm thinking that it's going to be because of the stuff about the definition of a triangle. But so what's going on here, if there's just this disagreement, is that it seems in principle, at least possible, to say that, again, in this case, we're not disagreeing, we're just talking about different things. Okay? So if everyone else holds the contrary thesis, we can say we're not disagreeing, we're just talking about different things. We relativize again to worlds, just like we do in the case of the wind is cold. Right? So in my world, the triangle has this, and in your world, the triangle has that. If we're Protagorean relativists, notably as well, I think there's something that isn't going to be happening for us. And I'm not sure if Plato realizes this or not, but I don't think that we can aggregate the sum total of individual beliefs held by other people and make it a question of numbers. Because if everybody has beliefs about different things when they have beliefs about the triangle, then you can't really add up all of those people and say, look, 999 people all think X is F, because they don't, right? We only got the relativism by changing what the subject of the belief was and individualizing the subject of the belief to the believer. So if that's what's happening, it isn't quite right to worry if everyone disagrees with us. Because if we're really Protagorean relativists, we can just say, well, those people don't all disagree with me in the same way, because all of them really have beliefs about different things. And my belief, in turn, is about something different. So there's a broader issue that will also emerge, which is that if we're really thoroughgoing Protagorean relativists, why should it be that we care about whether or not other people express beliefs that are superficially similar to ours? Because if we're really thoroughgoing Protagorean relativists, the thing to say is that we don't ever really disagree at all. It just superficially looks that way sometimes, right? So you say the wind is cold. I say the wind is not cold. And really, we're both describing something that is private to us as individuals. And the issue is that we use the same word, the wind, to describe this thing. But you mean your internal experience of the wind, and I mean my internal experience of the wind. So if we're going to become relativists, Plato has shown pretty well that this is going to entail the Heraclitean idea that certain things, being, you could say, emerges out of conflict and context-dependent interaction. Like rubbing the sticks together to get a fire, the world shows up only ever to situated individuals who have a particular vantage point, and what shows up is influenced to that vantage point to such an extent that everyone has their own private universe. Right? That's what the view that started out with Protagorean relativism ended up becoming when we added these other things. So it's hard to know how disagreement is even possible. And what that means is really we shouldn't be adding together all of the people who quote unquote disagree with us and using that as particularly strong evidence. Now, so far, I want to stress this, I've only been looking at this disagreement situation without adding the further belief that the other person is wrong. And that's important because there is one kind of self-refutation style argument that is going to emerge when that further belief is also on the table. So I'm going to add that belief in and see what the issue is. I want to point out, though, that you might think that if you're a Protagorean relativist, you recognize a disagreement with someone else and you get involved in arguments with those other individuals, you might think that that alone, without anyone believing that the other person is wrong, you might think that that alone constitutes a kind of self-refutation. Okay? Last time I talked about this type of self-refutation that is pragmatic, the idea being that the statement isn't itself contradictory in virtue of what its words mean, but when coupled with your behavior, more broadly speaking, you're refuting yourself. The totality of your words and actions are self-refuting. And you might think, and I think this is right, that if Protagoras simply continues the argument for anything, for any belief, that would constitute a kind of pragmatic self-refutation. Like, compare whispering, I am shouting. Now, there are other cases where pragmatic self-refutation is a thing. Okay? So, for example, it standardly is believed that if you say that a particular action is morally wrong, and you sincerely believe that, you don't then do that action and feel no remorse. Okay? We would think that if you said something was really drastically morally wrong and then did it and showed no further regret, we would tend to think that you were lying when you said that you thought it was wrong, or that you don't understand what the word wrong means, right? So you could also imagine someone saying, hurting other people is wrong while they're attacking someone. So someone might behave in a certain way that is, in some way or another, a refutation of what they're claiming to believe. Okay? This is kind of what we're talking about here. Because if Protagoras is going to get incensed and argue with someone else about a claim, doesn't this mean that we believe, or that he believes, that there's some shared subject matter about which there's a disagreement? So if Protagoras and I disagree, and Protagoras really is a Protagorean relativist, we shouldn't expect that to concern him. And the fact that his behavior in continuing to argue shows some concern, we might think is a kind of pragmatic self-refutation of the sort that would occur if I said killing is wrong and then killed. It doesn't add up. So this is the idea. Now, this is especially going to be true if we're clear that continued arguing indicates a commitment to the idea that someone else has a false belief. All right. Remember earlier, and we still haven't fully addressed this argument because it's going to come back, there was a suggestion that maybe when we're teaching other people, when their beliefs are changing as a result of our activities, we can say that that's a legitimate activity, it was thought, without having to concede objective truth, because we just need to say it was suggested that the new belief system is better than the other one, right? So we could still potentially, if we're Protagoras, say, well, no, I'm just arguing it with you because it would be better for you to believe this other thing. Now, we're going to see that that falls apart when we are Protagorean relativists as well, okay? So we can't say that either. And that's been already introduced. Plato really has two arguments that he's very proud of, and I think justifiably so, in this first part of the dialogue. And these are the ones that he stresses are definite. And that is this one about self-refutation, or these series of arguments that have to do with this self-refutation, and the bit about how you can't really say that something is of benefit because it involves claims about what's going to happen in the future. These two arguments are kind of related because the way out for Protagoras in terms of this kind of charge would be to say, well, it's not that I think that the other person is wrong. It's just that I think it will improve them. And if that's okay, then it looks like Protagoras has escaped. But it's going to turn out to be not okay. Right? So it's going to be incoherent in a certain way for Protagoras to engage in any argument because he would really have no reason. So it seems. And if he does engage in argument, then that would constitute for us a reason to assume that he doesn't really believe what he says he believes. And remember, for Protagoras, what you believe is actually really important. So if you don't believe what you say, if that's even coherent, that's a problem. Anyway, so this thing about pragmatic self-refutation is thematized in the dialogue when Protagoras is referred to. In particular, the section where he's referred to as potentially popping his head up out of the ground, having some reply to Socrates and Theaetetus, and then disappearing. Later on, when the Heraclitean philosophers are described, they're described as not really being able to engage in argument. They just kind of like pop up, shoot an arrow of an argument at someone, and then run away. Okay? There's a reason for this, and I think it has to do with the self-refutation that would occur if they were to stick around and continue to argue. Okay? So there's already, before we have anyone having the explicit belief that the other person is wrong, there's already a problem. And you can imagine why, because we're essentially saying if Protagoras continues to argue, then he actually is thinking the other person is wrong. Or else, why is he doing it? Anyway, so there's another point to mention here about how this dialogue occurs. If you notice, Socrates facetiously says a few times, we have to make sure that we're being honest about what Protagoras thought. And it's very explicit in this section that we're looking at that he talks a lot about Protagoras' actual book, Truth. And this section is prefaced by a kind of reference to the idea that some of the things we've said thus far might not be what Protagoras would say, and maybe we're attacking a straw man. This is the idea of a straw man. You have a position that you're attacking that no one actually holds. And so your arguments aren't actually good against the real position, which is much stronger. So this section has been prefaced by this suggestion that we ought to be more fair with Protagoras. But I think this is meant to drive the point home that if you're really Protagoras, it doesn't really make sense to talk about such considerations. Because if you're Protagoras, what other people think about what you think, shouldn't you just accept that that's right for them? And so if they think that your theory says such and such, why do you care? Right? And so there's these subtle hints, I think, of the suggestion that pragmatically Protagoras is self-refuting. I think especially the fact that he kind of pops his head out of the ground and then goes back down, because he doesn't want to engage in further argument. Because the mere presence of disagreement, especially when other people have beliefs about what he believes, causes him problem. Now, there is also, even though I think at bottom it's not totally fair to say that the large numbers of disagreement constitute counter-evidence against a thesis, there's a certain irony here in the Protagorean relativist having to look at numbers to determine truth. The Bernier paper is really one of the best and one of the better papers in ancient philosophy, I mean. And it's good on this point as well. The Protagorean relativist has to look at numbers, according to what's being suggested here, to determine whether something is true. And the point here is that Protagorean relativism is sold, and I put sold here because it was attributed to Protagoras, who was a sophist. And sophists did sell their services. And I think it was sold as freeing. It can free you from the tyranny of the majority truth. And so one reason that people can be attracted to such a doctrine is because it seems to allow for us to respect what others believe in a way that allows for a certain kind of autonomy. But if it turns out that what is true is determined by some kind of proportion of believers versus disbelievers, that's going to be a very ironic result for this position, because it's doing the opposite of what it's supposed to be doing. Again, though, I am not sure that we need to suggest that the Protagorean relativist here has to do this consultation of the majority unless we add the claim to objectivity, which comes in when we get this further belief that the other person is wrong. Okay? So I want to turn now and add the assumption that the other person is wrong into the picture. So remember, the whole picture is that there's a disagreement about some matter of fact about the world, and then there's a further fact that the individual that disagrees with the Protagorean also believes that the Protagorean is wrong about the point. So let's imagine that I think the triangle has 180-degree angles. You think the triangle has 360, or vice versa. You also think that I'm wrong to think that. And I'm a Protagorean relativist. Somehow the conjunction of these things is supposed to cause a problem. There's also one additional assumption that is already present in these early arguments, although it's not stated as explicitly as it might be, and that's that the other person isn't a Protagorean. That's also, I think, needed here. Before I talk about what the problem is supposed to be when individuals have that pair of beliefs about, first of all, a ground level truth, we might call it, about how the world is, the wind is cold, and there's also a further second order belief about the other person's first order belief, that this one is false. Okay? Before I talk about that problem in particular, it's going to be easier to see how the third argument works, which is more across the board, straight self-refutation. Okay? There's a problem, even at this stage, once we add the additional claims that I just mentioned to the basic disagreement, but it's easier to see the full-on self-refutation issue first. So I'm going to continue to postpone adding the additional belief that Protagoras has a false belief, that your opponent has a false belief. So let's look at the second argument first. Then we'll turn to the third, where we'll talk about self-refutation proper and then reintroduce this assumption again and say what was wrong with the actual argument given. This is the second in the three argument set. And what of Protagoras himself? Must he not say this, that supposing he himself did not believe that man is the measure, any more than the majority, who do not indeed believe it, then this truth which he wrote is true for no one. So here we have a kind of observation that I think isn't it. I think you could call it self-refutation of a pragmatic sort if you think that what it means to be committed to a particular belief involves how you would behave in particular circumstances. So what do I mean by this? Well, I think what's interesting here is that normally we think there is a difference between saying that something is true and saying we believe it. Right? So we think that when we say something is true, that is saying something more than just I believe it. And I think part of what we're saying that's more, or part of what's, I don't know about entailed, but suggested by that kind of belief, is that counterfactually, in situations that are not like the one we imagine to obtain, with respect to what we believe, the world is fixed, except what we believe is slightly different, that we think even if I didn't believe it, it would still be true, and that I would therefore be wrong. Right? So if we entertain the idea that something is true, if we take that seriously, or even just entertain it to some extent, what we're doing there is also to that same extent admitting that if we believed otherwise, we wouldn't be correct to do so, and we would be mistaken. And that is part of what's being said by this is true over and above what you're saying when you merely say you believe something. From a behavioral standpoint, you might think that it's incoherent to accept that you think something is true and also believe, well, if I didn't believe it, then I would still be right either way. Because if you really think it's true, it seems like that further statement wouldn't follow. Now, this isn't a tight argument that I'm trying to present. I just wanted to point these things out about beliefs, right? So in particular, we look like we're normally committed to a certain counterfactual about things we think are true, even if I didn't believe the thing I think is true, it would still be true. I would therefore be wrong if I didn't believe it. So we normally take truth claims to be more than belief claims. And part of the more involves respecting this counterfactual. Now, Protagoras, it's just being observed here, actually needs to reject this counterfactual that I think normally we think is entailed or suggested by the claim that something is true. Instead, Protagoras needs to say that if he didn't believe it, then it wouldn't be true, right? And that follows from the idea that what he has said in his thesis was a certain connection. He asserted that a certain connection exists between our beliefs in the world. And it seeming to us to be F is necessary and sufficient for X to be F, for me in my world. And if Protagoras were to accept the normal counterfactual we, I think, accept when we think that something is true over and above just saying we believe it, he can't coherently say this thing. It's almost like the appearance and the truth of the appearance, they tend to almost want to become one thing, it seems to me. I don't know how else to express this when we really examine Protagoreanism, because we might in principle think that there's a difference between the evidence we have for holding a belief and the belief itself. But really, on this view, the evidence for holding the belief is the fact that we believe it. This seems to me to be a kind of thing that Plato is sometimes, it seems to thematize it. Anyway, so Protagoras can't say that if he didn't believe it, he would be wrong, or that if he didn't believe it, it would still be true. So it really just comes down to, for Protagoras, I happen to believe this thing. Right? And I haven't talked about it at length yet, although I will mention it. The contemporary philosophical account of knowledge is usually that knowledge is justified true belief. Right? So there is this idea of justification right there. And it seems difficult to understand what justification would consist in if the thing that justifies the belief just is the belief. You can't, in that situation, fail to have justification. And so it seems like the concept doesn't quite work. And this is an issue I think that's going on here as well. So this interim bit here, I think, is interesting because it suggests that Protagoras can't have the normal sort of commitment that one would have to say that something is true over and above the fact that they believe it. If there's a difference between these two things, that something is true and that someone believes something, then they need to have a different content. And this person can't have that. So this is what I was getting at earlier about the idea that there might be something pragmatically self-refuting in the fact that someone continues arguing, say. That was the easiest, And remember, pragmatic self-refutation is what I was referring to when someone, for example, shouts, I am whispering, right? Or whispers, I am shouting. I don't want to shout. So whispers, I am shouting, right? There's pragmatic self-refutation. The sum total of their behavior is serving to refute the content of their statement. And this is also, potentially, we could say, the case in Protagoras when he doesn't respect the normal counterfactual that we tend to have when we say someone believes something. Because normally, we tend to say that someone who believes something has to believe that even if they didn't believe it, that would mean they were wrong. That's what it is to believe that your cognitive state is justified. And that is part of knowledge, right? Part of what we're saying when we're saying something is knowledge is not just someone believes it, but that their belief has a certain status, that's a very good one, in virtue of the fact that they have done something appropriately connected to gathering truth in order to get it. Right? So if someone just guesses that something happens at the end of the novel, but they've never spoken to anyone who's read it, or they have no reason for guessing this, it's random, that's not going to count as knowledge because the person doesn't have any justification, right? So in the idea of knowledge, we could say there is certain commitments to certain positions about what you would do in other situations or what would be happening in other situations. And we could, it's pushing the idea of pragmatic self-refutation, but we could, I think, say that those things maybe are that sort of self-refutation. You're not really committing yourself to the kinds of rules that are normally followed when we're using statements like, it is true. And I point out here that this is a wider phenomenon. So sometimes committing ourselves sincerely to statements suggests certain behaviors. If I were to say that stealing is completely wrong in every circumstance, and then I stole without remorse, this is the example I used before, wouldn't I be undermining my claim? Right? Would I be, or maybe you don't think I would be? In some cases, right, behaving contrary to what you're saying can actually be not just, it can not just fail to be counter evidence. It doesn't always refute you. There are some cases where I think a dissonance between what you say and what you do can actually be an important indicator that you're telling something that could be true, that you have more purchase on the truth. So what I mean by this is if someone has really experienced the ravages of a particular addiction and that person says, don't do this drug, it would be wrong to say, well, you're a hypocrite. Because part of the reason this person is justified in saying this drug is so terrible is presumably because they've struggled to get off of it, right? So there are cases where we counteract our behavior and, people can say that's hypocrisy, but really it's not necessarily undermining, epistemically undermining in the same way that other kinds of disconnects between behavior and statement. So it's important here that you don't feel remorse, right? But it just seems like part of what we mean when we say something's wrong is that you don't do that thing. And if you do it, then it's appropriate to feel guilt. And so if someone doesn't display any of those further things, then it's almost like, do they even really believe this? It tends to undermine our belief in their initial statement. So notice also that this connects to that earlier idea of continuing to argue for the thesis. That could also be, as I said, pragmatic self-refutation. And it's hard to explain why Protagoras will care what Socrates and Theaetetus think. And as I mentioned earlier, Plato seems to drive this point home by having Socrates go out of his way to state that he wants to get it right when reporting what Protagoras thought. You have to wonder, well, wait a second. Does that mean, if Protagoras cares about that, does that mean that there are objective truths of a certain sort? Or does Protagoras' theory really commit him to the idea that even when other people state the content of what he believes, they have as much purchase on the truth as he does? Because Socrates certainly seems to think that it would be an act of injustice to get the details wrong. The question is, should Protagoras feel that way? Does he? Because on one understanding, why should he? If he does that mean there's an objective truth, right? So we're getting now to the actual self-refutation argument proper. All of these arguments have a certain kind of overall behavioral refutation involved in them, I think. This is actually an argument where it seems like the things that Protagoras has to say will end up refuting him. Okay? So the other cases, it's like also what he says, but it's kind of also just the fact that he continues to argue, regardless of what the content of his arguments happens to be. This is more specifically a case of self-refutation because it's really something he says. And in the idea of refutation proper, it's like something said is a refutation, a counter-argument. So this is more properly speaking a refutation because it is a direct result of something he has to say, some specific thing he has to say. So secondly, it has this most exquisite feature. Protagoras admits, I presume, that the contrary opinion about his own opinion, namely that it is false, must be true, seeing that he agrees that all men judge what is. So there's a question here, right? So remember in the other cases that we looked at so far, I said that the mere presence of disagreement isn't itself necessarily a problem, right? Just because, and this was especially true in the temperature of the wind case, because we can just say, well, what you're talking about isn't the same thing as what I'm talking about. You're talking about the wind as it appears to you, and I'm speaking about the same thing. And so there's no real tension. I can still say what I want to say. You can say what you want to say, and I can just say, well, that's true for you, right? So there might be an issue here where we might ask ourselves, and this is why I think it's worth going through this argument in full, and this is why Bernier does such a good job with it. It's in part to answer a question. And that question is, why isn't this a good objection? Okay, because I said at the beginning that when you first encountered this is what happened with me. I thought, yeah, it's a good argument. And then I started to worry about this worry. And then I realized, with Bernier's help, that this actually isn't a worry on any kind of robust and substantive understanding of the thesis of Protagoras. So the worry that I think it might be natural to have, I had it anyway at some point, why can't we just say the same thing in this case that we did in the other case? Like, it made perfect sense to say that perhaps in the wind case. And then when it came to the case of the triangle, there was some hesitancy in me anyway to say the same thing. But that had to do with all kinds of further ideas about what triangle means and things like that. So at least just making the move wasn't problematic in and of itself. So why can't we do it here? Why can't we just say that Protagorean relativism is false for those to whom it seems false, but still true for Protagoras? That was the way that we could avoid having any kind of issue in the earlier cases, right? Because we can't really say that there's disagreement because disagreement seems to involve us in the claim that one of the two parties is wrong. And we don't want to make that claim. And so we end up limiting what people are making claims about to the actual thing that appears to them. And this becomes a problem when people disagree with us. And that, I think, is because that situation really forces us to see the issue with thinking that we only ever believe things about our own appearances. Okay? Now, this issue has been lurking for a long time. Because remember, when we looked at the development of the Protagorean relativist doctrine, that man is the measure of all things, into the more full-blown metaphysical picture that we see in the Heraclitus stuff, right? So all of these motions, the passive motions and the active motions. Once we got to that, I was raising questions to the effect of how on earth does this claim to what the world looks like fit in to the Protagorean theory? Like, based on the Protagorean theory, it seems impossible that someone could have such evidence. Like, did this just appear to Protagoras at some point? All of this? No. He's believing that he has reasoned to this position. But, of course, that requires the idea of evidence. And that means certain beliefs have to be more or less justified. It's harder to know what the difference between reasoning and just thinking random things is on a Protagorean view. Anyway, so the issue here is that someone disagrees with Protagoras, and further follow-up questions require Protagoras to kind of confront, I would say, a certain tension that has been in the position so far. And that tension was first revealed when we noticed that Protagoras was saying a lot of things that it's not clear he should be able to say given his theory. And so here he's going to have to say certain things that, again, he's not entitled to. And so, again, it's going to demonstrate that his view is impossible on his view in a certain way. If you believe his view, you can't believe his view because his view includes things that you wouldn't be able to believe according to his view. And so this is an issue if it's true. So what if Protagoras just avoids it? What if he doesn't believe that the other people are wrong? What if he thinks, well, they're right about what they're talking about and I'm right about what I'm talking about? They've got their own views about the Protagorean relativist thesis, and I have mine, and theirs are true for them and mine's true for me. And no one's wrong. Is it possible that Protagoras can say that for Socrates, the Protagorean thesis is false, but for him, Protagoras, the thesis is true? Right? Because this is what we did in the other cases with the wind and perhaps even with the triangle. So how is he refuting himself? Why can't he just say that? Well, again, this gets back to the idea that truth, when we're giving the Protagorean thesis that if something appears to you, then it's true for you. When we're giving that thesis, those words need to mean something. So they need to be telling us something that is not just repeating the same thing twice. Like, it has to be possible for this to not be true, for it to be some information to us that it is true. And Bernier does a great job of illustrating this, and this is what I'm really taking from him, is that if you look at the thesis, appearance is necessary and sufficient for truth in a world, it has to be that appearance and truth in a world are different ideas. Because otherwise saying that one of these is necessary and sufficient for the other wouldn't be interesting. So this is where we need to remember this and exactly what it means to say that something is true for somebody in their world over and above the mere claim that they believe it. Okay? And the idea that we brought in was truth in a world. So there's not just one objective world. Everybody has their own worlds. And the way things appear to them is determined, is, this going to be the same as the way things are for them. And we had the necessary condition, if X is F for Socrates, then X appears F to Socrates, right? If it doesn't appear to you that the wind is cold, then for you in your world, the wind is not cold. And the sufficient condition, if X appears F to Socrates, then X is F for Socrates. So if the dog appears red to you, then it's also true in your world that the dog is red. And we want both of these to be substantive, meaning they have to have content. This means that when we say that X is F for someone, we can't mean by that just that they believe it, or just that that's how it seems to them. Because again, we want the Protagorean idea to be an interesting claim about the world that's potentially controversial. And so it can't be that the Protagorean thesis just is, if X appears F to Socrates, then X appears F to Socrates. That's what we call a tautology last time, meaning a statement that's true in virtue of meaning, and it's not interesting, right? Because it's just telling us if X appears to Socrates, then X appears to Socrates in a certain way, right? Like, so you're just getting the same thing and no one would be interested. So these two things, what it is for something to appear to someone and what it means for something to be for someone, they have to be different. And so the idea we got was that to say that X is F for someone goes above and beyond just saying that they believe it or it seems that way to them. To go above and beyond it, it has to mean that there's a statement it's making about a world. Because if it's going to provide a grounding to the claim that this is for an individual, it has to be that it is in some world, right? So we're going to have a Socrates world and a Theaetetus world and a Protagoras world and so on. And the truth condition is going to be met by saying that in the private world of that individual, there is a certain state of affairs that obtains, and this state of affairs ends up making the statement or the representation, it appears to me, it ends up making it veridical. Right? So you have this appearance, maybe it's a belief, maybe it's just a perceptual phenomena, because remember, both of these are in play in this discussion when we talk about eistasis. You have this belief, there needs to be something over and above that we're saying when we say that if it seems a way to you, then it is for you. You can't just say if it seems to you, it seems to you. So that has to be that there's a world that you have, okay? Now, the reason we can't say that Protagoras can just concede, well, it's true for you that thing and it's not true for me. The reason why we can't say that is because if we take seriously the claim that other people live in worlds of their own that make all of their appearances turn out to be veridical, then that means that since it doesn't appear to other people that Protagorean relativism is true, then for those people, Protagorean relativism is not true. Okay, so what Protagoras is committed to, if he's really going to be a Protagorean relativist, if what he's saying is going to be interesting, is some idea that for these people, their world is such that any statement they make turns out to be true, given what their world is like. It's like the dream case. If you see a red dog in your dream, then there was a red dog in your dream. If you don't, then there wasn't a red dog in your dream. Right? Whether or not there's a red dog in your dream just happens to be a matter of what happens in your dream. There's no other fact of the matter. This is the view. So here we are saying either that these individuals have concretely entertained Protagorean relativism and they think it's false. That's one possibility. Or they perhaps just have never even considered the thesis. And this is going to be the case of most people. Most people aren't philosophers and don't necessarily think about these things often. And so there is going to be a large number of people who just are such that it doesn't appear to them that Protagorean relativism is true. And if it's really the case that it seeming to be the case that Protagorean relativism is not true, makes it in a person's world that Protagorean relativism is not true, then that person is going to be in a world where Protagorean relativism is not true. And what that means is that when they're having beliefs about what you believe, if you are a Protagorean, that person now can be describing your beliefs because they are not in a world where Protagorean relativism is true. They don't believe they are. It doesn't seem to them that they are. And we've understood that in order for Protagoras to be saying something that's not just a repetition, if it seems to you X, then it is X. Or sorry, if it seems to you X, then it seems to you X. We want him to be saying, if it seems to you X, then it is X. And we wanted the second thing about the way things are to mean something more than just you happen to believe it. And that has to do, we said, with there being some world that makes that true. And so Protagoras is forced to concede, if his thesis is to be substantive, that for the individual, Protagorean relativism is false. And that means that if the individual has further beliefs about the things that Protagoras or whatever Protagorean might be present, if others have further beliefs about what the Protagorean relativist believes, those individuals also will have an ability to deal with objective truth. Because for them, the Protagorean thesis is false. And so for them, when they make up their minds about anything, not just Protagorean relativism, about anything, the Protagorean has to admit that they are right. Otherwise, the claim is he's not a Protagorean relativist. Now, one could say, perhaps we just don't want to apply Protagorean relativism to itself. Perhaps we just want to say, look, we're not talking about this particular case. And in fact, I think that looking at the way Plato develops his argument, it is the case that what gets included in something seeming or appearing to be the case to us, it grows bigger and bigger. And this seems to be an almost inevitable result of the commitment to the thesis that knowledge is perception. Because as we are forced to acknowledge that we know certain things in the course of understanding the thesis, we end up having to include more and more things into perception. So you could think that there's an expansion of what eistasis means, and this is kind of near the end when an individual now has to concede also, Protagoras is also now including within appearances, people's appearances that concern what my appearance is, like the truth of my appearance. So people can have appearances to the effect that my appearance is wrong. And we're now to include that. You might think, well, no, we just shouldn't include that, right? So one way that we could potentially stop short of this full-on refutation is by perhaps putting limits on what we think can count as knowledge or truth. There might be certain statements that we simply say are meaningless or something. And these kinds of statements about the structure, if you're a Protagorean relativist, seem like they should be in this category. So you could get around some of this by denying that such statements have a meaning in the system. But, in effect, that is just to claim that you can't really believe Protagorean relativism, or you shouldn't believe it. So, at any rate, if Protagoras recognizes that other individuals don't believe the measure thesis, and those individuals disagree with him, their beliefs are not going to be relative, because the measure thesis isn't true for them. Now, depending on what their beliefs are about, we get different types of self-refutation. There's a very limited kind of self-refutation that's going to occur whenever somebody has a denial of Protagorean relativism coupled with a belief that disagrees with one of, or an appearance that disagrees with one of Protagoras' beliefs or appearances. And the further belief that Protagoras is wrong on this point. And in these cases, the thing that Protagoras is wrong about isn't Protagorean relativism itself. In these cases, the thesis of Protagorean relativism isn't self-refuting. It doesn't refute itself. It doesn't show that the thesis is itself false. But in these cases, we still have an issue because Protagoras has to concede that the other person has a correct belief about Protagoras' belief, which means that Protagoras is wrong about that belief. But then what else is true? Well, it's also true in that case that Protagoras is wrong about at least one thing, and then Protagoras can't be the measure of all things in every case. So in that case, what ends up happening is the other person has a belief to the effect that one of Protagoras' beliefs is false, and that person, of course, can describe objective reality because the measure thesis isn't true for them. And so that person has this belief that Protagoras' belief is false, and Protagoras either has to concede that they're right, in which case he's wrong, or he has to say that this person is wrong. Right? That's the other option here. I haven't been talking about that option so much yet, but maybe I should be. This is a dilemma, right? So Protagoras has two options. Protagoras can concede that in this case he's wrong, or he can say, well, no, you're wrong in this case. But in either case, we have his admission that someone is wrong in some situation. And that's enough to show that the measure doctrine is false. It's also enough to show that the idea that knowledge is perception is false. Because if it is possible that some appearances, however we understand aesthesis, whether perception or appearance or belief more broadly, if some of those are false, then our definition that says knowledge is aesthesis is going to be wrong, because it precisely doesn't say knowledge is true aesthesis, right? It just says knowledge is aesthesis, and knowledge has to be of things that are true. And so this definition is going to, at very least, need to be amended. And I'm stressing this because this is actually going to be what the next definition is like. Okay, the next definition of knowledge, which is coming up next week, is that knowledge is true judgment. So now we've added the word true. And we've also changed the state that we're talking about. Now it's not perception, it's a kind of judgment. At any rate, we have this idea of Protagorean relativism, and it's been shown that in a context where there is a disagreement, and in particular, a disagreement plus someone else's belief that Protagoras is wrong, we get this problem. And that's that Protagoras has to concede that that person can have beliefs about some kind of objective world, and that person has beliefs about them, about Protagoras, that are different from Protagoras' own beliefs. And now it seems like they're talking about the same thing, or they ought to be. And so Protagoras can't deny. He can't relativize. He can't say what we think he can say in some other cases. So if Protagoras really holds relativism as a substantive thesis, if it's really the case that another person's beliefs are true in their world, and that this also applies to their beliefs about Protagorean relativism, then there is going to be an issue. There's either going to be a direct issue if the person denies Protagorean relativism. In that case, Protagoras just has to agree that the thesis is false. If they disagree about anything else, Protagoras needs to grant that someone has a wrong belief and that therefore Protagorean relativism is false. So there's two arguments, I think. One is exquisite, called exquisite. That's the one that has one stage. The other argument is sort of like a two-stage argument. But all of these come out sort of at once in this section. There's also in the middle, of course, this other argument to the effect that Protagoras will have to concede that if he didn't believe this theory, it wouldn't be true. And that's also problematic. So we have here the full exquisite argument. Secondly, it has this most exquisite feature. Protagoras admits, I presume, that the contrary opinion about his own opinion, namely that it is false, must be true, seeing he agrees that all men judge what is, undoubtedly. And in conceding the truth of the opinion of those who think him wrong, he is really admitting the falsity of his own opinion. Yes, inevitably. But for their part, the others do not admit that they are wrong. No. But Protagoras admits this judgment to be true, according to his written doctrine. So it appears. I think the "so it appears" there is probably also meant somewhat as a kind of dig at the Protagorean position. That's how it appears to us. What are you going to say about that? So we get here the steps. Protagoras admits that the contrary opinion about his own opinion must be true. And this is because he thinks that all men judge what is. And what that means is that it must be true for them in their world where relativism is not true, that they are right. And Protagoras has to agree, undoubtedly, he says. So he has to agree with their assessment that his own judgment is false. And the important thing here isn't the mere fact that we think that maybe the Protagoreans are right or wrong. The more important thing is just that there's a disagreement, so somebody now has to be wrong, because the Protagorean opponent has the ability to have beliefs about someone else's beliefs, Protagoras' beliefs. And Protagoras can also have those beliefs about his own beliefs, but that's all he can have, right? So Protagoras concedes the truth of those who think him wrong, and that is tantamount here to really admitting the falsity of his own opinion. Yes, inevitably. And again, the key move here is that while Protagoras can admit that this is the view of that person, he needs to admit more than that, because for this person, it isn't just their view. Unless, of course, Protagoras wants to say that they are wrong about that, right? But if that's true, then there's something that they believe that they are wrong about. And Protagoras, again, ends up in trouble. Right? So I've been focusing so much on how this self-refutation thing works that I have been ignoring the fact that there are different options that can be taken by Protagoras, right? So Protagoras doesn't need to initially concede that this other person is correct. He can say they're wrong, but then he's contradicted himself, right? Protagoras can say they're right, but then what they're saying is that Protagoras is wrong, and so then he's in trouble. There's going to be some belief that somebody has that they're not, that is false, that someone has the ability to say it's false. Because if Protagoras is right and the other person's belief is false, then Protagoras can say that, and that person is in the measure. So I just want you to see that there's no real way out of this in the way it's constructed, I think. Maybe there is. Maybe you can find one. So when we concede that Protagorean relativism is false for another person, we're basically conceding that they have information about objective truth. And at the same time, we have to deny that our beliefs are like that. Now, you might wonder, why can't you just relativize again? Already relative truths relativize them. For Protagoras, it is true that for Socrates, the man is measure of all things. So for Protagoras, it is true that for Socrates, it is true that man is the measure of all things. This, however, so this is what this looks like. It looks odd. It sort of denies the reality of Socrates, because now Socrates doesn't get to have his own beliefs. We only have the way that Socrates is believed to be by Protagoras. And again, this goes back to the dream idea, I think, of Protagorean relativism. It is like you're making someone else a part of your dream, because the necessary and sufficient conditions are going to hold for you. And other people, as far as you're concerned, on this particular construal of things, basically don't exist. So it might be that Protagoras could become a full-on solipsist, I think. I think it's possible that he could just deny that other people have meaningful ideas, and that can be expressed, right, through language, because we're going to see later that everything's changing all the time. So how do you put words on things? They're always in the process of change. Protagoras could go that way and basically just deny that other people are speaking intelligibly. And so he could just say, well, I don't know what they're saying, right? But now Protagoras is at risk of fairly extreme tension between his actual behavior and what he professes to believe. Because how is Protagoras going to keep engaging with other people? If he really thinks that what's true for Theaetetus and Socrates is actually what is true for him about what is true for Theaetetus and Socrates, then we don't really care what Theaetetus and Socrates think. And so there's no reason to engage with them, right? So, there are different ways that you can try to think your way out of this, but I think they all involve problems. If you want to go an extreme skeptical route, and there was a position, the Cynics, who knows if this is true, but the report we have of the Cynic individual, Diogenes, is that he would bark like a dog. Like, he didn't believe in human conventions, it seems. That's why he's so cynical. As we have that word now. But the Cynic seems like perhaps someone who could get along well with these Heraclitean, Protagorean relativists we hear about, who pop up and say enigmatic things and then disappear. So if we do try to take different ways out, we get into different kinds of trouble. Notice, though, and this is an important thing to leave off with, because we're talking now about how this argument works. Notice that this wouldn't be a problem if we didn't have disagreement. If everyone believed Protagorean relativism, then it would be true for all of them, and all of them would have beliefs that were about their own worlds, and all of them would confine their beliefs to their own worlds. They would all hold Protagorean relativism, and so it would be true for them. We need disagreement. And this is really true of all three of the arguments in the set, right? We start out with references to the fact that people disagree, and so that establishes that we're talking about a context where disagreement is assumed. And of course, in the real world, disagreement can be assumed. And this is true for the first argument, and it's also true for the second argument, right? If you concede that you might have a different view than you have now, you concede that you would disagree with yourself. And of course, in that situation, everyone's also said to disagree with you. And then in the self-refutation argument, we have disagreement again playing a key role. If Protagoras just isn't aware of disagreement, that could also be okay, I'm guessing, because Protagoras wouldn't have to face this issue, perhaps. I'm not really sure what to say. I suppose you could say that those individuals can still have correct beliefs about Protagoras because they've heard of him or something. But poor Protagoras is just trapped. Right? Other people can have beliefs about him, but he can't. So anyway, Protagoras, in the actual situation that he's in, has to make a choice. That's the dialectical part here. He's having this argument and he needs to say something in response to a question about what he's going to say about other people who have a certain belief about him. And once he's asked that question, he has to admit that his thesis is false in order to answer it. Either he just denies that the other person's belief about his belief is true, in which case the measure doctrine is false. He's just falsified it by denying that. Or he accepts that what the person believes is true. And then when we examine the content that he is assenting to, that content says that his belief is false. That means that he, Protagoras, has at least one false belief. So in this context, Protagoras can't say anything. And this is really, I think, just to step back from the argument and look at what has happened in the past few pages. There are a lot of things going on that I think fit together when we think about the dialogue. A fairly large number of things that are placed there for good reasons, to convey points. The idea of Protagoras popping up. The idea of being true to the position of Protagoras. Because this isn't a theme that we get in other Platonic dialogues. Like, there are other Platonic dialogues where characters are given positions that are similar to theirs, but the positions that they're given are never questioned in terms of, is this what the actual historical person would agree with? It's just that Plato gives this position to this figure that I'm guessing he thinks is objective, but he's not raising any issues about whether or not what they're saying can be trusted or whether it's unfair to the opponent. And here he really is, right? So we have this idea that the truth of what he's saying about what someone else is saying is thematized. And so now we're thinking about beliefs and how we're treating other people's beliefs and is it fair, right? And already that's something that if we sympathize, and if Protagoras sympathizes, we are going to have to admit that there are right and wrong beliefs to make sense of that sympathy, I think. So there's that. There's the Protagoras head popping up to try to fill in the blanks. And there's this reference to, yeah, it appears to me that that's what he's going to have to say, right? So there's a real unity, I think, to this section. We are going to move next time to cover the remaining 3 arguments in this section, okay? I think even just at this point, though, we can see, if we look back at what's covered, that it starts in a really focused way with applying this thesis to the case where it's most plausible, that of direct perception, and then it expands that. And now we've gotten an expansion that allows individuals to have beliefs about other people's beliefs. And then we're going to have an argument that has to do with having beliefs to the effect that something is beneficial or good. And it's going to turn out that those involve a sort of prediction that is going to be at odds with Protagorean relativism, capacity for prediction. So we've got in this section up till the next argument we'll cover next time, and we'll cover the remainder of this first definition next time. We have here just an expansion of the category of what counts as eistasis. And we start constructing more and more arguments as we build beyond the initial stage. Anyway, I will see you in class on Thursday.